Perfect. Hola, Capital Humano. Muy buenos días, buenos lunes para todos. Hoy vamos a tener una entrevista muy interesante con el profesor Richard Wolff. La entrevista va a ser en inglés, pero lo bueno de YouTube es que aquí abajo pueden poner los subtítulos por si quieren ver los subtítulos en inglés. Va a ser una entrevista muy buena. La verdad es que tenía tiempo queriendo platicar con el profesor Richard Wolff, que es un pensador que admiro mucho. He leído un par de sus libros y además él también ha sido profesor de unas personas que son grandes influencias para mi manera de pensar. Mantengan, como siempre, el respeto en el chat para tener una buena conversación. Pueden dejar desde ahorita sus comentarios, su like, suscríbanse al canal y aquí vamos a estar conversando. Without any further ado, Professor Richard Wolff, thank you so much for taking the time, for coming on the show with us. I was telling everyone how excited I am to have this conversation with you. I'm a big fan of, I've followed Democracy at Work and your critical mindset and your way of analyzing current issues and providing some extremely assertive feedback on the way we should look at things and think critically about the events that are currently happening with us. Also, I've read recently, around last year during the pandemic, your book, Democracy at Work. It was a big inspiration for me. I actually took that book very much to heart, and I started transforming some of my business models to closer reflect the value of cooperative, of worker co-ops. And I think some of your work is very much necessary, especially in South America at the moment. So, Professor Wolff, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very eager to speak with you.
Awesome. So let's start with some basic questions for the people that don't know you yet, because one of my main intentions of having you on board was to show people from Latin America that there are minds such as yourselves that we should be listening to in order to take advice and to decide what to do with the reality that is presented to us. So if you don't mind, Professor Rich, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you're currently working with.
Yes, I was born in the United States. I have lived and worked all of my life in the United States as a professor of economics. That's what I have done. I am the product of the elite schools here in the United States. I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, 10 years of my life in the Ivy League. And throughout that time, every effort was made to persuade me that capitalism is the highest achievement of the human race. In 19 of the 20 semesters I went through, not one word was assigned to me of a criticism of capitalism. Only in one semester in Stanford University with a Marxist professor named Paul Baran, did I have an occasion to learn anything about a criticism. The rest of my education was a one-sided, indefensible celebration of capitalism, which is what most higher education in economics is about in the United States, and that has been true for at least the last 75 years.
Absolutely.
However, because I went to the elite schools, it was possible for me to get employment, to be a professor, because the United States is very hierarchical. And if you go to the right schools, people really imagine that you can do something you can't do if you don't go to those schools. It isn't correct, but they believe it, and it has been helpful to me. I have been a critic of capitalism all my adult life. However, immediately after the crash of 2008 and 9, everything for me changed. So that, for example, where before that I would be invited to do a media interview maybe once every 2 or 3 months, I now do, and I have for the last 8 or 9 years, I now do somewhere between 3 and 5 media interviews every day. Wow. Here in the United States. I've never seen that before. From my perspective, opportunities for a left-wing, anti-capitalist, critical perspective, the opportunity to present that and to discuss it in the United States is far greater now than at any time in my life. And you can see from my gray hair that I've been here a while. So it is a remarkable time. I do a weekly radio and television program here in the United States. I've been doing it for 10 years. It goes out, it is broadcast on about 100 radio stations, and through the television, it goes into 40, 50 million American homes. I mean, they don't all watch it, but they could, if they are interested, see it. My work is published all over the place. It's a completely new and different United States from everything I experienced throughout my career. So it is a remarkable time, and there is real political movement here in the United States. And as I say, from a left-wing perspective, the prospects in this country, while difficult, I don't want to make them sound easy. They are not. They're difficult, but they are better than they have ever been before in my lifetime, basically since the Second World War.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I find very interesting about your comment and saying that that you see right now this perspective that possibilities are actually feasible, that something that was not realistically for the last few decades, I would even say so. And it's interesting to say, I'm sure you're familiar with Francis Fukuyama's work about the end of history, right? And how he had to review his notion of the end of history. And he feels that the last three real events, actually real events, not spectacle based, were 9/11, the Trump election, and COVID. Those three events, according to me, were fundamental in the sense that they show in many, many ways, in an evident and almost irresistible way, the limits of the capitalist system, in the way that we're currently living in this constant state of exception, where government seems to, in a way, they capitalize on these huge events to enforce harsh policies in order to sustain the decrepit life and artificially extend the life of capitalism. I don't know if you what you think about my reading, but in a way, a lot of the economic crash we're seeing right now during COVID is nothing but an extension of the crash of 2008. In a way, it was just a continuation of the same story. Like it's insane that, like you said, that we say capitalism is the most efficient system ever invented, but it crashes every 6 years, which is absurd, right?
Yes, no, I might choose different events. For me, the crash of 2008 and 9 was the crucial event, because, again, and I'm an economist, so I see things a bit more that way. But, we had been taught, my generation had been taught, that the Great Depression of the 1930s was a lesson for capitalism. And that even if you weren't a persuaded Keynesian economist, nonetheless, you had learned from John Keynes and all the work that came out of that, how to manage capitalist economies, how to use monetary policy and fiscal policy to contain, to limit, and ultimately, in the enthusiasm of it all, to prevent business cycles.
Right.
And the crash of 2008 was so deep and lasted so long that it completely destroyed the notion that this is manageable. And for the few people who didn't get the lesson, the crash of 2020 finishes the conversation. Absolutely. And, COVID, I agree with you. COVID, but that we are just at the beginning of that process. Americans still can't quite come to terms with one simple statistic. The United States has 4.5% of the world's population and 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. Yep. A rich country, a country with a highly developed medical system, has such a disastrous failure that it's going to take years before the reality of what that means sinks in. And meanwhile, so many other things are happening. that I also want you and your viewers, your partners there, to understand that for the first time, in a long time, there is a significant body of opinion in the United States, on the left, on the right, and in the middle, that is beginning to have the opinion that the American empire is over.
Yep.
That over the last 20 or 30 years, a kind of peaking has occurred, and that we are now on the downward slide of the history of American capitalism, and that we are therefore in uncharted waters, because we have been luxuriating in the second half of the 19th century and basically the entirety of the 20th century on a trip up to become the dominant global capitalist economic colossus.
Superpower.
And the reality that this is over is at this point, this is still being viewed with what the psychologists call denial, the pretense. In a way, the United States is recapitulating the sad, pathetic history of the United Kingdom. Even in the United Kingdom, there are still people like Boris Johnson who can't face the reality. Tony Blair couldn't either. And we are now viewing the United States as following in that tragic decline.
Yeah. So one thing that is very interesting, and I'm a big fan of the critical school of Frankfurt. And one thing that is interesting is that this notion that empires at the end of their cycle tend to become very repetitive in their art form. And I think is one of the key takeaways that we can see, that it's repetition of the entertainment industry shows a lack of innovation, a true lack of innovation. Like innovation doesn't really exist, or is not really promoted properly within capitalism. It's just a repetition of the same values under new notions. So it's a change of aesthetics, but not necessarily of the forms behind the aesthetics. And this is one key takeaway that people can see about this, exactly like you mentioned, like the end of the cycle. So, of course, this end of the cycle is provided or is promoted or is provoked by a series of material conditions around the world. And I will say one of the key factors within this change in the material conditions is the rise of the economic superpower of China. So what is your take between, is this the transition period? Is this potentially the beginning of a new Cold War or a new form of war that we haven't even witnessed before in the past? And called economic digital war between China and the US in this time period of the transition between the hegemonic power of the US and the hegemonic power of China. And this is just an initial question, because I would like to dwell more into that topic after that. But what's your take? Am I right to say that this is a power transition?
I think so. I think it's a transition of enormous importance. And I think the way to get that idea across is to make it clear that the United States, for at least a century, has not had a serious economic competitor.
Yeah.
I mean, the British long ago reversed their role from being the colonial power and the weak colony. We became here in the United States the dominant partner, and Britain has become a weaker and smaller entity ever since. The United States has not had Britain as a competitor. The Soviet Union never rose to that
European
level.
Union as well.
Germany and Japan were pushed out of they never got to that point anyway, but they were pushed out of the picture by World War II. So for at least a century, and probably a good bit more, all the way back to the First World War, we have had a virtual globe to play in, a globe to expand into, a globe to collect the food, the raw materials, the minerals, the metals, to process and control here, financially, manufacturing, all of it. And that is over. And the irony of it all, which Marx himself would have enjoyed reminding us of, is that the leading role in doing this has been capitalist enterprises who chose to maximize their profits by leaving Europe, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, and moving to China, number one, but also India, Brazil, Mexico, and a variety of other places, but none so much as China, and none of the other societies had been able to mobilize their people to make this strategy work. You don't have anything in India comparable to the Chinese Communist Party. And this is not in favor or critical of them. That's another matter. They are not perfect. They have done bad things, all of that. But I'm simply talking about the ability to mobilize your public and your private resources to achieve key goals. And
Right.
let me just finish this point.
Absolutely.
COVID is a good example. China has 4 times the population of the United States, at least 4 plus, so 1.3,
1.3. Yeah.
1.4 billion people, and we have 330 million. We have 700,000 dead people from COVID officially.
Yep.
The Chinese have about
40.
7,000.
Yep.
This is an unspeakable difference. This is a poor country. Even now, China is still a poor country, has none of it, but it was able to mobilize, whether it was in the city of Wuhan at the beginning or later on with the lockdowns and the controlled transportation. They mobilized their society to defeat that disease, and they succeeded. For the last 4 decades, they have achieved average economic growth per year in the range of 6 to 9%. During the same period of time, the United States economic growth was between 2 and 3%. I mean, there's no contest here. One society is able to mobilize to outgrow the other one, and we see the effects of it every day.
And the levels of debt, because debt in the US is becoming a really, really, really unsolvable problem. Like the financialization of growth from the federal government, it's becoming humongous.
Well, we say here in the United States that the American capitalist system is now on life support, financial aid from the Treasury, and above all from the Federal Reserve. Absolutely. But I also, when I talk to workers groups, the real wage, that is the money wage adjusted for prices, the real wage in China has quadrupled in the last quarter century. And in this country is stagnant. It's gone nowhere. I mean, these are differences that are historic. You don't find that in human history, this kind of a divorce of history from societies that are in contact with one another as intimately as the United States and Japan and China. So you're seeing a break. You're seeing the emergence of a new hegemon, perhaps, certainly a new power, and the decline of an old one. And no one, this is really important, no one knows in the United States what to do. So what you see is the kind of childish return. Well, we succeeded in a Cold War with Russia, so let's do that again with China so we get the same outcome. That's not going to happen because the world has changed. China also learned lessons from the Soviet Union, including its collapse, so that you can't think like that. That's also so mechanical and so childish that you begin to realize it's less the ideology of the neoconservatives. I mean, it is that, but that's not defining this. The definition is we have no idea what to do, so we're going to do something we did before.
So it's purely reactionary.
Yeah, this is the level of American diplomacy, which is why you see all the mistakes, all the buffoonery, because they have no idea what to do.
So this is interesting. we probably give neoconservatives way too much credit in their behavior, when in the end they're just being purely reactionary. And it's interesting because one of the critiques of reactionaries that I've read that I really enjoy from Gramsci is this notion that they want to go back to an ideological place that never existed in the first place, because they talk about justice, they talk about growth, and in the end, when you see historical materialistic facts, growth came when we had this social welfare state. Like after the Green New Deal, after the Bretton Woods Treaty, after Bretton Woods, we had growth. But because we had a very strong welfare state, and the world was rebuilding after the Second World War, and then after the 70s, when the neoliberal ideology took place in America and started spreading all over the world, we started dismantling the welfare state, and then we started giving more and more freedom to the market to self-regulate, this religious fantasy that most neoclassical economists believe in. And it ended up to all these problems that we're now seeing. So do you think, and this is a segue into my next conversation, because in the end, living in Latin America, it's almost like a condemn, like you're condemned to do something. It's like a destiny in a way. They say jokingly in Mexico that we're very far from God, but too close to America. Almost like this complexity of saying whatever you do economically, you have to align with your commercial partners. And I think that China comes into a very interesting place for Latin America, because now suddenly we can choose. In the end, I think every country in Latin America that chose to move to the left in economics and politics ended up creating a dispute with the US. And that was not easy to play around. Like, even if the lefty politics in Latin America were very much accepted, everybody is very forward thinking, we're progressives because we are a younger generation, we're younger countries, younger cultures, we're more we're conveying naturally to the left. But the issue is that moving to the left in Latin America implied getting embargoes, getting intervention, and getting into this game, losing game with your closest super powerful neighbor. But now I think China comes to change that dynamic, and suddenly we can choose. Suddenly I think politics in Latin America are just saying, like, guys, now we can either play with the US or we can play with China. And China, it's a very interesting commercial partner. Of course, I agree with what you said, with their faults, with their problems, with their areas of opportunities and everything. But suddenly it feels like future is open for new possibilities. So what would you suggest into these new possibilities? Should we be looking more towards doing business with China? Because China for a long time was also only a supplier, not a consumer. And now things are changing. They're buying from abroad as well. So I think that dynamic is very interesting for this historical moment.
Yes, I would have several things to suggest to you. Number one, you must understand on your last point that the United States, if you understand and study the industries that are moving towards China, and let me underscore, there is a tremendous battle going on here in the United States between the large corporations who have already made massive commitments to China and who don't like Mr. Trump's hostility to China and didn't support it, and they don't like Mr. Biden's either. If I had to bet who wins this struggle, it's the commercial business interests, not the politicians. It's not resolved yet. It may go. If they can create a big enough theater of Cold War, they may force the business interests in the same way that Hitler forced the business interests of Germany. But in this situation, there is a big struggle. The Chamber of Commerce wants trade with China. The Business Roundtable, the other large business organizations are all against tariff wars, trade wars, all of that. Number one. Number two, they are very clear. They want to be able to invest in China for two reasons. Number one, to produce there and make more profits by shipping the goods back for consumption here. But the second reason, which is just as important, they cannot risk being excluded from the Chinese market. Because the Chinese, as you put it, are buying. They have developed their middle class, their relatively well-paid urban working class has disposable income.
Yeah.
And that disposable income is rising faster than mass income anywhere on earth. And consequently, if you're a capitalist, you have to be, for competitive reasons, where the growth is. And China is where the growth is.
Interesting.
So that'd be the first thing. Absolutely. You will be able now, places like Mexico will be able to sell in China.
Yep.
You'll have to compete for that,
Yep.
but it is there. And the more you can give to China for what it wants to import in the way of oil and raw material and so on, the better the deal you'll get when you want to sell to China.
Absolutely.
Anyway, the second thing I would say to you, don't go so far as to forget about Europe. The Europeans are thinking the way you are. We have a choice now. And be very, very observant, I urge you, all of you in Latin America. The Germans and the French and the Italians and the Spanish, above all, those four, they understand they are at a historic moment also.
Yeah.
That they are going to have to work out a new economic and political relationship, both with China and Russia, but especially China. And they are rethinking everything having to do with the United States. Last point, the United States is making a mistake, a big one, that I'm telling you this so that you don't make it. Don't ignore the Europeans. Don't forget them. They are a bigger market than the United States. They have every reason to unify, to make money out of their enormous size. The departure of England in the long run will be a blessing for them, and they are going to be players too. It may take them a while. They have all kinds of problems they haven't solved, but they are not gone. And they're going to be a bigger player than even Japan, which is sitting there on the edges and doesn't know which way to go.
Yeah.
But
if I may ask you just one question on this topic of Europe before we move on to the next point, Professor, is this notion that, the fact that England took place in this Brexit movement, and now the European Union is the other countries that you mentioned, and this current political event in Germany where they're moving back to social democracy in a way, which I think it's very much transcendent in this way of how the big block of economic powers around the world are either aligning with the left or with the right economically. Even if it's a gross generalization, it feels like some of these countries are going back to more social welfare state, seeing that in the end, giving more liberty to the market doesn't necessarily lead to the growth that it was expected. It just leads to more debt in the end. And I think that one of the key facts that you mentioned is this notion that for me, one of the key economical problems that we have in the world at this moment is the collapse of aggregate demand. This notion that, wages are stagnant for the past 50 years almost, and productivity has risen by 70%, which makes no sense. We have more stuff to buy, but we cannot buy it. I think that the notion of alienation for Marx is more relevant than ever. More than ever, people are working on stuff that they cannot even buy. They're producing goods that they become alienated, not only by the natural process of capitalism, but by the hard fact that they cannot buy what they produce. And now we're seeing that not only that, but it's also very much an impossibility for the growth of economy, because if people cannot buy what they produce, then markets become stagnant. Then you have to rely on federal debt, and then federal debt leads to cutting deals with banks, and nobody wants that. And so I think in a way what we're seeing in Latin America related to something that happened in Asia is that we're seeing like this Latin American spring, like this politics becoming alive again, and people becoming involved in politics again, and we're caring again. It feels like history is finally moving again, that we finally got over all the sequels from Marvel superheroes, and finally we have options. Like finally there's something new on the horizon, and it feels like more than ever the the speech should be how we should learn from these past mistakes, and what are the things that we should leave behind, and what are the new options opening up. And I think this is what is very interesting about your analysis, and you're completely right to give us the heads up about Europe, because I think it's super timely that the UK was left out, and suddenly the left is gaining power again in Central Europe. So what will be your analysis on what is happening in Latin America specifically, if you have any information? Because I know you have done several interviews with some figures from Latin America. What will be your take, your advice, your analysis of our current situation?
Well, in my humble opinion, and I remain someone who has much more to learn than I have to teach, I see a coming together of the problems of the left in Latin America as being very similar, maybe more than ever before, to the problems of the left in the United States, in Europe, even in China, where there is a left and a left criticism because of their official Marxist loyalty. They have that. The problem, if I could be so bold, the problem of the left is that it is at a historic moment of opportunity. I mean, let me just for a moment dwell on the German election last week. You have a country which has beaten back the left for the last 50 years by an endless anti-communist drumbeat.
Yeah, propaganda, red scare.
As totalizing as McCarthyism and everything else in this country has been for the last 75 years. And yet Angela Merkel could not govern Germany for the last many years without being in a coalition with the German Socialist Party.
Absolutely.
And now in this election on the 26th of September, the German Socialist Party defeats Merkel's party and becomes the number one party in Germany. And at the same time, in Berlin, 56% of the people voted in a referendum to socialize 250,000 apartments in Berlin, to take them away, to expropriate these apartments from the private landlords, convert them into public housing so that Berlin replicates Vienna, where you already have that.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And now the third item, which very few people have heard of, and it's a wonder of what Western media does. Austria, as you know, is a very conservative Roman Catholic country. It has two big cities, Vienna, where socialism is always dominant. But now comes the second city of Austria, which also had an election last week. It's the city of Graz, G-R-A-Z. It's a city of 350,000 people with a surrounding urban area of another 300,000. So it's the second major metropolis of Austria. In the elections last week, the winner, the number one political party, is the Austrian Communist Party.
Wow.
Not the socialists, the communists.
Incredible.
What in the world is, and by the way, they've been growing steadily over the last 20 years. So this is not a flash in the pan. This is not something, they got 20% of the vote 4 years ago, and they had a big increase now. Okay, what's happening here, in my judgment, is a historic opportunity. You are right, Diego, in what you said. The neoliberal, globalizing, all of that is in terrible. Nobody trusts it. Nobody believes in it. Whether you are a right-winger who hates immigrants or you are a left-winger who hates capitalism, that we all agree on is a disaster. That's the good news. That creates the opportunity. But now comes the bad news. The left has no new strategy, no new clear idea of what it is going to do that
Exactly.
really changes things. Instead, I'm going to be mean now, but we don't have a lot of time, so I want to be clear. What you have is a warmed over old socialism.
Agree.
We're going to have the government come in. The government is going to do these useful things. We're going to help the mass of people. We're going to improve the health care, and we're going to update the infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. You can't do that. I don't think the mass of the people, even though they're desperate, will find that an exciting opportunity. I may be wrong. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I don't think so. You have to give them something that will work. Because remember, the old socialist government programs were instituted in most of these countries, but they never survived very well.
Sure.
In this country, they've been undone almost entirely.
Yep.
Even in Germany, they've been weakened. They've been reduced. Not as bad as the US, and so in France, and so in Italy, and so in Spain, and so in Britain. So the mass of people will sooner or later say something like this: we are not going to struggle to produce again what we know our enemies will undo as fast as we do it. You have to take a new step which prevents, which gives us a chance to prevent losing what was created when the old socialists got their social democracy. And that's where I come in, because the answer is you have to remove the people who have the incentive and the resources to undo the New Deal from the 1930s or social democracy in Europe. You got to get rid, to be blunt, of the capitalists. They have to be gone. There cannot be 10%
banks at the table,
5% of the people sitting at the top of the economic pyramid, disposing of vast amounts of money, which they can then use to buy the parties, to buy the political candidates, and to rewrite the law. And the way to do that is a transition from a capitalist enterprise to a worker co-op. This is an exciting new way. This is going to be a socialism for the 21st century that I think can present itself honestly as a new direction, a radical change in our lives, and can say to all working people, particularly the young ones, you
absolutely.
are not going to spend your life in an office or a store or a factory living the way your parents did. This is a new world. And if we do it right, then I think we can win.
So one thing that I think is crucial to this point that you're making, Professor, and I'm glad we're actually touching on this point before the end, because it's one of the most common questions I've gotten in the past few years. As I made my own company's transition into worker co-ops, a lot of people were asking, like, how are you going to make it? What are the steps? How to follow it? And I think your content and your book provide a lot of insight on how to do that. So my question would be, how are the new technologies enabling something new regarding cooperatives and raising the level of worker co-ops to a point where they can compete with capitalist enterprises? Because in the end, we know that competition is tough because capitalist enterprises tend to abuse low wages, war territories, exploitation, the south of the world. They use all the exploitation to provide goods at an artificial low level of price, right? So how can worker co-ops compete with those artificially low level of prices with something that is more democratic, that is more just, that is more fair, that is creating the right type of the type of world that we want to live in, right? So how do we achieve that level of competitiveness with capitalist enterprises from worker co-ops?
You know, part of me wants to answer with all the answers I can give you that are in that book, but I think I have a better way to get it across, which is to tell you the story, if you're not familiar or if your viewers aren't, of those worker co-ops that have in fact been proven to outcompete their capitalist competitors, to be more profitable, to be more efficient, to last longer, and to grow faster. So let me give you two stories. The first one is about a remarkable woman researcher. Her name, I don't know if she's well known in Mexico, is Virginie. That's the French, she's French, the French version of what in English is Virginia, a woman's name. Virginie Perrotin is her last name. Perotin, Perrotin. She is a professor of business at the University of Leeds in England, even though she's French by origin. She has made her professional research reputation by carefully choosing two enterprises in a variety of industries that are similar to one another in the technology in general that they use, in the product they are making, in their marketing, and so on. But they are, and she had to find them, they are different in the key question of internal organization. So that one of them is a hierarchical, top-down capitalist enterprise, and the other one is a democratic worker co-op. She has done this in a variety of countries, in a variety of industries, over a variety of periods of time. The results of her research, you can imagine, I wouldn't be telling you all this if I wasn't about to tell you, is that the worker co-ops are more profitable, more efficient, last longer, everything. In other words, she's done the actual work and can show you empirically with all the bells and whistles what has happened. Perfect. And the other one, I'm sure you know, is the Mondragon Corporation, which again has its problems and has its weaknesses. It's not about that. But they started in 1956 with 6 workers and a Catholic priest. And they are today the 7th largest corporation in Spain. They own the largest chain of supermarkets in Spain. They have over 100,000 worker members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are organized as a family of about 200, 250 worker co-ops, unified under one corporate umbrella. They have their own university in Mondragon, that's in the north of Spain, the Basque area, just below the Pyrenees Mountains that separate them from France. But they are a wonderful story that this works. As they grew from 6 in 1956 to 120,000 now, which, by the way, would be the envy of capitalist growth stories anywhere in the world.
I agree.
As they grew, they defeated in competition capitalist enterprises. They tended to absorb those workers into themselves, which often happens in capitalist competition. And they are trying to develop a different way of working together so that the co-ops support one another. They pool a certain portion of their surpluses to have a fund to help them through difficult times, et cetera, et cetera. But I can't go beyond that, but I want to be clear that that's not a weakness. There is no way to know in advance how this emerging alternative will solve its problems. And the way to understand it is to go back and remember Section 8 of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, where he talks about what he calls the primitive accumulation. He talks about the transition from a feudal economic system into capitalism. It didn't happen all at once. It was episodic. The early experiments in capitalism often didn't last more than a few weeks or a few months or a few years before they figured out how to assemble the conditions for a long term. And, you know, we should think of the Soviet Union and of the People's Republic of China and of Cuba and of Vietnam. These are the early experiments from which there is as much to learn what to do as there is to learn what not to do. And that's what's happening. And we will, in Scandinavia, socialism means government control, private capitalist enterprise. In the Soviet Union, it meant government control, government enterprise. China is a combination of these two, is an attempt to figure, it's crude. It's a crude way of trying to have a better outcome by mixing rather than either or. Okay, that's what these experiments are for. So far, the Chinese seem to be doing real well. Who knows? But the trick for us is I don't think the mass of the people require or demand proof that we are going to go in this direction and nirvana will happen. That's stupid. That's not, we can't do that, but we can give a direction. We can propose changes that give us a real chance to get out of what now the majority of people understand is a dead end. In this country, I don't know about you, you have a Obrador that is a different thing in Mexico. But the vote here for Trump should be understood as the disaffection of a huge portion of the American people from the entire political establishment. It was as much a rebuke of George Bush and all of that part of the Republican Party as it was an opposition to the Democrats. And you can see from the growth of Bernie Sanders and the very rapid growth of a whole slew of social democratic young people like Ocasio-Cortez and the others, you can see that something like this is happening more slowly and with more difficulty on the left. But the signs are unmistakable. The middle is disintegrating.
Yeah, it is a very, very exciting time. So one final question to close the interview, Professor, if you may allow me, because I don't want to go over the program schedule. I don't know if you're aware of what happened this week globally, the Pandora Papers. I don't know if you heard the news. So what's your take regarding this notion of taxation as an effective tool because it's strange. Marx said that one of the ways to transition from capitalism to communism was taxation, taxation, taxation. Of course, this notion has to be reinterpreted given the new conditions of the world and everything, right? But then again, I think that I have heard divided opinions towards the extended effectivity of taxation as a method to provide the material necessities needed for the transition from capitalism into post-capitalism. What is your take on this idea of tax the rich? And being very blunt, and now that it's becoming super relevant and everywhere, that real estate was one of the biggest global loopholes for billionaires to take money offshore and create these empty shell companies and just hoard properties and create these inflationary bubbles of real estate all over the world. What's your take on the relationship between inflation, taxation, and real estate properties?
I would answer that what has often happened again. That the people who learned the most from Karl Marx were not the working class to whom he addressed his writings, but the ruling class who was smart enough to figure out the answer. So the answer to tax has been evade, evade, evade. And we have a cat and mouse game in which the people demand the taxation. The reformers, like me, push for the progressive taxes. They are either passed or not. If they are not passed because the businesses are strong enough to prevent it, if they are passed, the businesses then hire the lawyers and accountants to get them around it. Mostly they change the law here at home so they don't need to hide the money abroad. It's only when whatever it is they have here doesn't suffice for a particular circumstance, well, then they always have hiding it abroad. For me, this is the endless mistake of reformism. Yeah. If you don't do something about the inequality of income and the inequality of wealth that modern capitalism has produced, where the richest 80 people in this world have more wealth than the bottom half of the population. I mean, under those circumstances, those wealthy people know that their wealth is being held hostage by politics, because the mass of people are poor and they are a small minority. So if you have a world that believes in universal suffrage, which we do, then they have to control the political situation. And they will do that with their money. And if they can't get the political situation under control in this country, they'll go to the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands or Switzerland or wherever it was. And now you see, when they are getting into trouble abroad, they came up with a new plan starting about 15 years ago, which is they found those states inside the United States, South Dakota, Nevada,
Texas,
Biden's Delaware, which has been a home for corporations for 200 years.
Yeah.
We now, they will go wherever they need to go,
fiscal paradises,
whatever they can. But you're not going to fix that. You're going to do something. Then 10 years later, you'll discover how they got around it. Yeah. And 10 years after that, you'll plug that hole. Meanwhile, they've gotten another one. This is absurd, this crazy game. If you have to deal with the fundamental inequality. And by the way, one of the benefits of worker co-ops is that the distribution of the wealth produced in corporations will now be decided democratically by all of the workers. They are never going to give 1, 2, or 3 people vast amounts of money when everybody else can't, send their kid to college. This is crazy. So the worker co-op is a way to get at the basis of this problem, rather than another series of reforms.
I agree. I mean, I agree profoundly with the limits of reformist thinking. In a way, we have to push more towards structural change that will eventually provide a condition for post-capitalism, then again and again getting into the stupid notion that it is fixable. I think the people that still defend the idea that it's fixable is still in denial, very much in denial, by the overwhelming majority of facts that inequality has gotten worse, and social change and inequality and environmental change, and now COVID and hunger. It's absolutely insane. So, Professor, not to take any much more of your time, I think we have final 3 minutes. If you have any closing remarks that you would like to make for the audience, we currently have over 1,000 people live watching this discussion, and it's going to stay in my channel for as long as YouTube still allows me to. So, if you have any closing comments, I would love to hear them.
Yes, I would argue to people a simple reality. If in the United States, the center really of world capitalism, the dominant power for at least the last century, if it is now possible, as it is, to be openly and consistently critical of capitalism, which I am telling you I can do, and I am not alone, not by a long shot. It's all over the place. The audience is bigger than I have ever seen it in the United States, and it is growing very fast. And so if we can have that going on here, all of you can do that where you are. And then let's use the modern techniques, whether it's social media, whether it's blockchain, whether it's whatever is coming down the pike. Let's talk to each other. Let's figure out ways to collaborate. I think we're on the verge of very, very big changes. Frightening, absolutely, but also full of a promise we haven't seen since the Paris Commune and the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, when much of all of this began. Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope we can renew this conversation in the near future.
Absolutely, Professor. Thank you so much for your time, for your words of advice, for your patience, your tone, it's almost good to talk to professors because you have such a clear and patient way of explaining things, which I think is necessary and also counterintuitive to most social media culture, where everybody's just speaking over each other and insulting, and we play these dumb games of debate. And I think we need many more rational voices like your own to get people connected and giving new relevance to theory. Because I also don't think there's room for us to just play the nostalgia game without being critical of past mistakes and reivindicating this theory to have a modern energy. Okay. So again, Professor, thank you so much for the conversation. This is going to be online for a while. I'll send you the clips. Everyone that was in here, make sure to check out Professor Wolff channel in YouTube and his social media. I will leave all the links below this video so you guys can check it out. If you plan on doing a worker co-op, you must read the book. You must follow Richard Wolff, and there will be plenty of advice for you guys to tackle this new stage of our economic era. Professor, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye. See you guys.
Bye-bye.